Predicting who wins champs is probably one of the hardest problems in the world. Optic were the favorites in 2022 when Loud ended up winning. Fnatic looked absolutely unbeatable in 2023 until EG took the crown, and I'm sure nobody expected EDG to win it all in 2024. There are just so many meta shifts and map pool changes throughout the year that make it really hard to judge whether or not a team is actually good. And on top of that, many teams grow immensely throughout the tournament itself, making them completely different from when they first qualified for the event. Despite all these variables, there are 3 big truths about Pro Valorant that I've come to realize after all these years. 3 truths that really determine whether or not a team has both the potential and consistency to win it all. All these traits were exhibited by both PaperX when they recently won Toronto, T1 when they won Bangkok earlier this year, and in my opinion, will only become more and more relevant as competitive Valorant continues to mature. Let's talk about these 3 traits of championship winning teams, look at how we can quantify these traits with statistics, and find out exactly which teams are actually in form to win champs this year. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes a team good, but also what separates the good teams from the great ones. Most people will probably point to specific players on teams who make the impossible possible, but in my opinion, individual player performance is just not something you can really rely on. Just because players like Forsaken can actually win a 1v5 doesn't mean that he's going to do that on the regular. Let me remind you that after this 1v5, PaperX still lost the map and series, and it wasn't really even that close. All good teams have players capable of game-changing moments, but one of the biggest differences between good teams and great ones is that the great ones can achieve a high level of team-wide consistency. What I really mean by team-wide consistency is that they're able to ensure they win rounds that they should be winning, or in other words, rounds where they have a significant man advantage. The only way to shut down individual players that are having a strong game is to have even stronger teamwork and systems in place. If you think back to Toronto or even Bangkok, there are probably a couple really important rounds that stick out. In Toronto, the final round between PaperX and Fnatic was a 4v2 retake that most people would easily agree Fnatic should have won. In fact, when you have a +2 man advantage in VCT, you usually have more than a 90% chance of winning that round. If Fnatic won this round, they could have 100% won the entire grand final, but they unfortunately lost a round in overtime where they had a significant advantage. Back at Bangkok earlier this year, there was an even more damning scenario between G2 and T1. If you're a G2 fan, you probably will never forget this round where G2 are up 12-10 on match and tournament point. Jagamo kills 2 players on B, and it looks like we're about to crown a new Masters champion, but suddenly they're too rushed to win the round and throw their advantageous position. In both these cases, it was the second place teams who failed to close out key rounds where they had significant advantages. When we compare other teams from both these events, we can see that the teams who ended up deep into the tournament looked more consistent in rounds where they're up at least 2 players. At Bangkok, T1 and G2 were the most consistent teams, each winning over 90% of all the rounds where they had a 2-man advantage. At Toronto, PaperX wasn't necessarily the most consistent team out of the bunch, but they were at least one of the more consistent teams with a higher 2-man advantage win rate than Fnatic, who ironically lost the grand final to an exact round like that. It's obviously important to win these rounds, but it's important to win any round. So why are these rounds that much more important than others? We all know that Valorant is a very momentum-based game, so maintaining momentum in a round like this is incredibly important, especially when there are only 12 rounds and a half. You're 9% more likely to lose the next round if you lose the previous round, and that's with pistol rounds already removed from the data. Economic effects are obviously the reason for most of this 9%, but I also looked at the isolated impact on team morale when you lose the previous round, and the results are really interesting. Looking at VCT 2025 data since the beginning of the year, even if you have absolutely no economic advantage, you're still 1.1% more likely to lose the next round after losing the previous one. This percentage actually goes up when we only look at rounds where you threw an advantage. When teams threw a round where they had at least a 2-man advantage, they were actually 1.7% more likely to lose the next round, even when both teams had similar loadout values. 1 to 2% might not seem like a lot, but that's really significant when there's no economic advantage at play. And that's why it's so important to win the rounds that you actually have an advantage. But what about getting into those advantageous rounds to begin with? That leads us to the next important trait of championship winning teams, which is their likelihood of actually getting into those advantageous positions. I value this trait a little bit less because just like winning random clutches, sometimes players will just hit insane moments to start off rounds that are simply not reproducible, but there's obviously a tactical aspect at play too. It's important to understand the relationship between getting into good positions and closing them out, so I plotted each team's performance from both Masters events earlier this year. How often each team is able to actually get into advantageous positions is on the x-axis, and the ability to close out those rounds is on the y-axis. Fnatic is usually considered one of the stronger tactical teams with boasters calling, and at Masters Toronto, they were able to get into 2-man advantageous positions in 50% of all their rounds, which is extremely high. This is probably why they were still able to make the grand final despite being worse at closing out rounds, since they were simply able to get into more advantageous scenarios than other teams. G2, on the other hand, was the complete opposite during Masters Toronto. They were the most consistent team at closing out advantageous rounds, but struggled to really get into those positions to begin with. The teams that you see pull away up and out towards the top right of this graph are going to be the teams that showed true potential of winning it all. So you're mainly seeing the finalists and teams who made deep runs in this area. It's really cool to look at this graph for VCT Pacific Stage 1, which happened before Masters Toronto, because even though PaperX was Pacific's 3rd seed going into Toronto, you can see that they clearly already had the makings of a championship winning team. RRQ were the team that actually won Stage 1 in Pacific, but they were the worst at getting into man advantages and also closing them out compared to PaperX and Gen G, both of which were more successful than RRQ at Masters Toronto. With this in mind, we can get a good indication of which teams going into champs actually have potential to go far, because every team that has gone far seems to exhibit significantly higher ratings in these two traits. Looking at Stage 2 data for all regions except for China, here are the results. Based on this criteria, G2 are big favorites to win champs this year if they're able to maintain their form from Stage 2. Even with Baby Bay being subbed in for Leaf, who many would consider one of G2's best players, you can see their system is still intact and they're still one of the best teams at closing out rounds they should be winning. I think any team in this top right quadrant, all the way down to PaperX, GIANTX, and Fnatic, have potential to go very far in this tournament if they're able to maintain and improve on their form. DRX could look like a little bit of a dark horse in this graph as they show consistency in closing out rounds, but there's just some sort of gap in understanding on how to start rounds better. But I want to talk about one last thing that's incredibly important for a team to win a championship. The most underrated aspect of becoming a champion is something I've talked about before, and that's having a wide enough range of play styles to be able to challenge every single type of team. I talked about this in my previous video on PaperX winning Toronto, where they were finally able to win rounds that dragged on longer compared to how they were before. This graph shows their cumulative round win rate, which follows a team's total win rate as the round lengths increase. You can see that in 2024, PaperX were really great at fast rounds, but kinda sucked when rounds dragged on too long. However, at Toronto, they were a much more well-rounded team, which is one of the big reasons they were finally able to win a championship. I graphed this exact same style signature for all the grand finalists of the past 3 events back to champs in 2024. I colored the tournament winners in gold and the runner-ups in silver. What's really interesting from this graph is to see that all the eventual winners of these events in PaperX, T1, and even EDG back in 2024 all had relatively smooth curves that don't reveal a lot of weak points in their playstyles. We're still able to see the identities of the teams come out, like PaperX and EDG have win rate spike during the mid-round, while T1 was a very dangerous team at Bangkok when they ran fast rounds. But throughout the rest of their curves, there weren't massive weaknesses for their opponents to abuse. On the other hand, each of the runner-up teams have a much clearer dip in their curves, with G2 and Fnatic being much weaker at the early round compared to the late rounds, and Heretics having trouble playing out the mid-round. This leads me to believe that having a wide range of playstyles is absolutely essential to winning a Valorant championship in 2025. So we're going to take those couple outliers from the previous graph about consistency and plot out a style signature for each of the teams using their Stage 2 data. Here are all the style signatures for the most promising teams participating in champs this year. There are so many interesting things to point out about each team's shape. One thing that stands out to me is Fnatic, who are historically one of the best teams at playing slow, but now have one of the highest fast round win rates in the world. This could be a good sign for Fnatic fans, as it hints that they might have fixed their issue with rounds timing out and may now have all the tools they need to win. G2 still has a bit of a weakness when rounds are too fast, so we'll have to see if they're able to keep up with faster teams at the tournament. Sen and PRX nearly have identical curves which favor fast rounds, but are still relatively solid into the longer rounds. Now, based on all of this statistical analysis, I would still say that G2 are the most likely to win based on their Stage 2 performance and consistency throughout the entire year. But I think that Team Liquid have a really good shot based on their playstyle curve, which has a bit of a weakness in the early round, but shows that they're really solid in rounds past 70 seconds all the way through to the end. The caveat to all this is that a lot of time has passed since the end of Stage 2, so there's a really good chance we'll see some different play patterns at champs, especially when the level of competition is so much higher. But I hope you at least enjoyed a more data-informed tier list video, and be sure to stay tuned for more content throughout the actual event. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video, and I'll see you guys next time.